Alright, in this video, I'm going to show you two ways to create a kick drum tone using a sine wave. Now, none of the four core oscillators here have a sine wave option, but we do have a sine wave in this LFO in the modulation section. It can also run at audio rate if the rate is bumped up fast enough. And that should work perfectly in order to create a kick drum tone. Now, we can also generate a sine wave with the filter in self-oscillation mode. So two different sine wave sources we have on this synth. Let me start with the modulation oscillator here. Alright, so we need to listen to this oscillator. So I'll take the wave out and plug it into oscillator 1 input on the mixer here. I'll bring the level down on everything else except oscillator 1. I'll set it at the 12 o'clock position for now. Make sure the oscillator waveform is set to sine wave. And let's speed up the rate on this modulator to bring it up to audio rate. We don't need to filter the sound, so make sure the filters are not in play here. And now we hear that pure sine wave tone. There's no key tracking, but that's fine because we don't need to play it. We just need to hear one consistent tone. I'll pitch it down a bit lower so it's closer to the kick drum register. We can always tweak this later on. Now let's shape the amp envelope. So the sustain needs to be all the way down. Let's increase the decay. Probably not too much, maybe at the 9 o'clock position. Alright, the next thing we need to do is to give the sound a bit of a punch. So we will do that with some pitch modulation on the modulation oscillator. I'll use the filter envelope for this. So I'll take the envelope out from the filter envelope and plug it into the rate in on the modulation oscillator. In terms of the envelope shape, the attack should be all the way down, release all the way down. Bring up the decay and sustain all the way down. Now the modulation depth is way too wide. We need to tone that down. So let's disconnect this and plug it into the input on the attenuator. So the envelope out goes to the input on the attenuator here, and the output of the attenuator goes back into the rate in. So now with the attenuator, we can control the modulation depth. Let's tune the sine wave down a bit. It's not quite in the kick drum register here. Okay, now let's slowly reduce the decay on this envelope here. You want to get to the point where you don't hear pitch modulation anymore and just that punch on the kick. I'm going to increase the modulation depth here. Maybe a little bit of release on the amp envelope so we don't hear any clicks and pops. Maybe some sustain as well. Alright, that works. It's a bit soft and mellow. We can crank up the level here on the mixer, so it's also going to distort the signal. It sounds pretty cool when it's cranked up. But if I tone it down a bit, that sounds pretty good too. You can fine-tune the fundamental by adjusting the pitch on the modulation oscillator. If you want the kick drum to be a bit tighter, you can bring the sustain all the way down on this amp envelope here, decay further down to a point where it sounds a lot tighter. Cool. Now let's take a look at creating that same kick drum sound but using the filter. I'm going to break down the level of all the inputs on the mixer. So this way I'm going to ensure nothing goes into the filter. And I'm going to set the filter's resonance to a high value. So this way the second filter is going to self-oscillate. I'm going to make sure we're in series mode here and bring the spacing all the way down so the first filter is out of the picture. So now when I play on the keyboard, we hear the sine wave tone, which is being generated directly from the filter. I'm going to tweak the amp envelope a little bit, but essentially it still has that percussive shape. Let's pitch down this tone lower by bringing the cutoff down. So now we're more in that kick drum register. Make sure the resonance is all the way to the highest so you get the loudest sine wave. Now the next element of the sound is to create that punch. We already have the filter envelope modulating the filter cutoff. So I can just bring this dial up and adjust the amount of filter cutoff modulation. In this scenario, that filter cutoff modulation results in pitch modulation. Alright, so this works, but it's a very pure sine wave tone and also very weak. It would be nice to run this through the mixer and crank up the level to introduce some distortion. So I'll take the VCF2 output here and plug it into the oscillator 1 input on the mixer. Now I don't want any signal to go into the filter, especially the second filter. So I'm going to plug in a cable on the second filter and not connect it to anything. So this way, no signal is going into the filter. Now let's take the output on the mixer and plug it into this mult here, because we need 2 copies of it. One copy from the mult will go into the input on VCA1, and the second copy will go into VCA2's input. Now when I bring up oscillator 1's level here, the sound is a bit louder and it has some saturation as well. Interestingly, the saturation or overdrive sound is not as aggressive as when compared to the internal routing. But that's alright, so we end up getting a different tonality on this kick drum as compared to the previous one. So that's how you can create 2 different kick drum tones on the Moog Matriarch. I hope that was helpful. Please stay tuned for more.